broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, 6 key metrics that impact webinar performance before, during, and after. Sponsored by Citrix's GoToWebinar and brought to you today by the Content Marketing Institute. My name is Joe Polizzi. I'm founder of the Content Marketing Institute and I will be your moderator today. Throughout our presentation, we really encourage you to interact with our speakers by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane. So we'll be answering those questions live during the event and after the presentation. So you'll see kind of how Mike and I work this presentation. There'll be a lot of Q&A back and forth, and I'll do my best to work your questions in throughout. But if we don't, we'll get to them at the end with about 10 minutes left or so. But please insert your questions whenever you have time. You can also follow today's conversation on Twitter with the hashtag #CMI, that's #CMI, and all the speaker handles are there. I'm Junta Joe, and Mike is at Webinar Ready, and then of course go to Webinar. I do also want to remind you that we'll have lots of information on today's call, so before you ask the question, will the slides and presentation be available? They will, and you will get an email within 24 hours on the archive presentation of today's webinar. I'm just a little bit about me. I'm at Junta Joe on Twitter, Joe Polizzi, founder of the Content Marketing Institute and SocialTract. I've written a couple books. One is Get Content, Get Customers, and most recently with Robert Rose, Managing Content Marketing, which is all about the life cycle of content marketing and how to effectively manage it into your organizations. A little bit more about the Content Marketing Institute. CMI's total focus is really on developing how-to and training information that helps marketing professionals build out their own media channels, similar to what we're doing on today's webinar. We primarily do this through our events like Content Marketing World, our media properties like Chief Content Officer Magazine, which by the way is free to all qualified subscribers, and our consulting group, which sets up corporate training sessions and content marketing strategy assignments for companies like AT&T, Tyco, and PTC. Just a final reminder before I pass it over to Mike. Content Marketing World coming up September 4th through 6th, 2012 at the Columbus, Ohio Convention Center. If you don't know by now, CM World is the largest content marketing event in the world, where we'll have this year over 70 of the leading content marketing experts, and we already have hundreds of major brands, major and minor brands signed up, including senior marketers from Level 3, Google, SAS, IBM, Majestic Steel, Nationwide, Caterpillar, Cisco Systems, and on and on and on. I really do believe this. Content Marketing World is the one event where you can really learn and network with the best and brightest in the content marketing industry, so we really hope to see you there. And without further ado, now on to today's speaker. Really happy to have Mike Agron on the call today. Mike is co-founder and the executive webinar producer for WebAttract. As a former high-tech sales and biz dev veteran with such companies such as Apple, Oracle, and MapInfo, his focus is in producing what he calls high-performing, high-impact webinars, and this is absolutely the truth because I've had the pleasure of being on a number of webinars with Mike. With very predictable outcomes, and he's done this for global brands such as Google, IBM, Oracle, Underwriters Laboratories, and many emerging B2B and SMB firms. Also, just to let you know, I know we just talked about Content Marketing World, but Mike will be running one of our key workshops on the A to Z of webinar creation and distribution. So if you really get a lot out of this and you want to take the next step, you'll love the workshop at Content Marketing World. So Mike, so happy to have you on the call for the webinar performance today. And before I hand it off to you, can you go into just kind of set the stage for where the metrics are, where you're getting this information on the metrics so that we'll be using throughout your presentation today?
Sure, Joe, and thank you, and hello to the audience, and thank you all for joining us today. Well, if you take a look at the timing, happens to be that today our new ebook that we co-authored with Citrix on a step-by-step guide on webinars really contains 3 pillars. One is the methodology, which is very important. 2 are best practices, but the 3rd are the metrics, because I learned a long time ago. In fact, I had a sales manager who always used to say, if you're not lost if you don't care where you're going. And I never forgot that, especially when it came time to forecast review. So metrics have become a very important part, and we've done hundreds of webinars, and we've decided that if we want to be able to produce predictable outcomes or have our clients produce predictable outcomes, we have to have some way to measure it, and metrics are the way to do it. And so what today is about is really covering what are 6 key metrics in their benchmarks. And this goes beyond email metrics. This is what happens during the webinar. And then I want to talk about where do you find them, and then how do you know if you're on track, and most importantly, webinars are all about getting people into a conversation after the webinar. So how do you take this information and convert more prospects into customers? And what I want everybody to get out of today is a new look on how some of these benchmarks and metrics can be used to help you get even more high-performing, high-impact webinars, because predictability is what business is all about. And again, we'll give you plenty of information, but feel free to contact us after the webinar. We'd be delighted to hear what your thoughts are and how we can help. But before we get started, Joe, I want to run a poll, and I'd like to understand from the audience what type of metrics are you currently using to measure your webinar effectiveness. So if everybody would choose all that apply, are you not using any? Is it the number of people who register or attend? Is it the quantity of fresh new sales leads? Would it be closed deals or other criteria? I think, Joe, this pretty much covers a lot of the topics. I think it'll be very interesting to see where folks are on this.
Exactly. I mean, we've seen it all, of course, and you have all over the board, whether you're looking at, are they just looking at numbers? And we actually have been talking to quite a few of our customers recently that just look at the closed deals that go through the pipeline. So that means you have to have a longer-term outlook.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we've just about got everybody who's going to vote has voted, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, so I'll give you another 2 more seconds, and then let's share the results. Quite interesting. And they should be popping up there. So looks like 16% of the audience uses no metrics. 58%, the overwhelming majority, look at the number of people who register or attend. 14% on the quantity of fresh new sales leads, 4% on closed deals, 7% other criteria. Joe, any comments on that?
No, I mean, I think that makes sense, and I think that I'm interested in actually hearing this portion. I've heard we've done a lot of these together, but I actually want to see how you can take that number of people who register and actually look at the metrics down the line that really can really make impact on the business.
Terrific. Okay, let's go to the second poll now, and the second poll would be to help us understand this. What type of systems or platforms do you use to track your webinar metrics? You know, when I mentioned earlier, Joe, about us creating these metrics, they really didn't exist in a classic form, so we kind of had to create our own and our own benchmarks. I'm very interested to see from our audience, do you use standard reports from your webinar provider? Do you have homegrown or a customized system? Or are you working with a marketing or sales automation provider or have none? So we're seeing the results come in. I'm going to keep this open for another moment. Then we'll share that, and we're going to jump right into today's topic.
Sounds good.
Very interesting where the results are coming from.
Well, yeah, I'm interested to see the stats here on the marketing automation provider.
Well, here we go.
Would you bring those up?
Yeah, very interesting.
That's interesting. You know, I would have said that would be a higher number on the marketing automation, but obviously that's where we're headed, where we want to see, you know, how we can take those leads and then nurture them throughout the life cycle of that customer prospect. Exactly.
All right. So what I talk about is high impact, high performing webinars, and that's really best explained by looking at this graph here. If you look at the x-axis, it goes from low to high, which is the value that you bring to your audience. And then on the y-axis, it goes from low to high on how well you meet your commercial outcomes. Webinars that are high performing meet or exceed your commercial outcomes, and webinars that are high impact add a lot of value to your audience. But this doesn't just happen. You have to be able to plan for it. And where you want to be in planning your webinars is making sure they're in the upper part of this graph. The high-performing, high-impact are going to produce the greatest return of opportunities to get new business. And you can also do it with some that aren't quite as impactful, but that's really where you want to be. But how it happens is through ensuring predictable outcomes. And before you even start your webinar planning, you've got to be very clear on what are your objectives. Is it, as we saw in the last poll, sales leads? Is it thought leadership? Is it better customer retention? And what is the value you bring into your audience? Is this stuff really timely and relevant? And is it targeted to your audience? And what are your success factors? Is it, again, the number of registrants, the number of attendees? And what's the call to action? Both the call to action for the audience. What do you want them to do after the webinar? And what are you going to do for following up on the sales-ready leads? And what's most important is being able to analyze the life cycle intelligence. And here's what we're going to be looking at. One of the beauties of a webinar is that you can create a relationship with your audience, albeit virtually, before the event, during the event, and after the event. Before the event, it's gathering profile data. For example, we know that of all of you on the call today, on the webinar today, that 19% of you are from high tech, 11% from marketing and PR, 10% from education, so on and so forth. That's fantastic information because I obviously can't meet all of you, and so this gives me a little bit of an idea of where you're coming from. During the webinar, we'll do online polls and live questions. We can gather valuable insights. And after the event, through surveys and on-demand views, using social media and lead nurturing. And probably what's most important is that when people do come to your landing page, you ask essential and non-invasive questions. And probably one of the best questions to ask that we always ask is, what would you like to learn from this webinar? You'll be so surprised at how the information comes back as to where people's interests are, and that's a terrific way to shape your messages. But now, let's get under the hood and start looking at what these 6 metrics are. And the 6 metrics that we're going to be looking at are what's called the CTR, or click-through ratio, how many people come to your landing page, how many people register, the attendee ratio, how many people actually attended from registered, how people participate in online polls and what you can learn from them. Same with the exit surveys. How well did you hold your audience? What's the audience retention? And what type of viral effect post-webinar did you have from on-demand viewings? Now here's a nice bonus for GoToWebinar users. If you happen to be a GoToWebinar user, all of this information is available in one kind of a report, and you just go to My Webinars under Generate Reports and you can pull the various data out of it. But let's jump into the very most important of all the metrics. This is the click-through ratio, and this is before the webinar. It's absolutely critical to registration, and it predicts success on attendance and just about everything else. Well, let's talk about what it measures. It measures the percent of people who actually register that have clicked onto your registration landing page. So people will click on the registration landing page, but that doesn't automatically guarantee that they're going to register. So there's a ratio there, and that tells us something. And what it predicts or impacts is what kind of registration you're going to have. And I'm going to give you some examples, how it impacts the attendance. It also tells you if your registration landing page is effective. Maybe you have too many invasive questions or sales questions, or it's too commercial. It also tells you how well your value prop and message is connecting with the audience. So to give you some basic metrics, we tried to drive a minimum of 250 people to register to a webinar, with 100 of them to attend. And the way we do that is we start with a targeted demographic audience, 50,000. We know 1.5% of those will reach the registration landing page. That's 750. We know that 1 out of 3, or 33%, will click through to register, and that's how we get 250 registrants. And we know typically 40 or more of those registrants will actually attend. Now, let's look at how we start tracking this information. And I recommend that you start tracking as soon as the registration landing goes live. This is from a particular campaign, and where it says TP1, TP2, we normally execute an invitation strategy over 4 touch points. And so for the first touch point started on July 30th through August 11th, and you can see the number of people that have registered. And then we were still in the middle of the third touch point. And what's interesting here is we get very excited every time we have a new webinar launch, because this gives us some very, very important feedback on how well we are connecting with our audience. But let's show you how to measure it. If you are using GoToWebinar, on the registration report, as you see here, it says registered and clicked on registration link. It's real simple. You just divide the people that have registered by the people that have clicked on the registration link. In this case, it was 54%, which is excellent, and I'll show you why. Now, here's what it showed us. As we went through each of these touch points, we could see that our click-through ratio for touch point 1 was 52%, for touch point 2 was 49%, and we hadn't even started touch point 3, but we had about 50%. That showed us we were really connecting with the audience. But here's how you know if you're on track. What you see on the left-hand column are benchmarks that we put together. On the right-hand column is what does it predict and what can you do to increase registration. Well, if your click-through ratio is above 34% to 50%, high five, that's excellent. That really means your message is connecting, you've got the right audience. If you're more within 25 to 33%, you're on target. You might want to ask, is your invitation message specific to the audience interest? Is there anything you can do to tweak it? But overall, that's pretty good. However, if you get under 25% or even into the high teens, you should be concerned because something is not connecting with your audience. So here's 5 things to consider. 1, are you really targeting the right demographic? 2, is your topic a must-have or a nice-to-have? Or, worse off, is it coming across as a covert sales pitch? If what you're communicating is not timely and relevant to their interest, they just don't have time for it. Maybe you're asking too many landing page questions that could be invasive, like, when are you going to buy? How much money do you have? Things like that. People are turned off by that. The other thing to look at from an email marketing standpoint, you're possibly using spam trigger words. There could be trigger words in the email subject line such as free or punctuation. And also, sometimes considering the invitation is in HTML, you might want to switch to plain text. Sometimes that can help pick up your registration. But these are 5 key things to help you know whether or not you're on track. Now let's move during the webinar to the attendee ratio. And
hey, Mike, can I ask a couple questions?
Absolutely, sure.
We're getting a ton of questions coming in, so keep them coming. But a couple specific ones were, and you and I have talked about this before, if 40% is a good benchmark for attendees to registrations, over the life cycle, let's say 6 months, how many of those people that registered actually view, let's say, the archive in total registration numbers? Or are you going to get to that?
I am going to get to that, but that's that's a great question. Yeah, I'm going to cover it. Yeah.
Save that for a second, and then I just want to make sure that you're going to cover, because we're getting a ton of questions on how many invites starting, how far out, all that stuff is coming, correct?
Yeah, well, no, I can answer that now.
Okay, very good.
We execute our invitation strategy about 3 weeks before the go-live date. And we do a series of up to 4 email blast or touch points that are spaced out. And we find that, and as you'll see on some of my tracking here, that we'll pick up parts of the audience on each one of them. So it's a good idea, 2.5 to 3 weeks, before you go live. Hopefully that answered the question you asked.
And then over that time frame, is it the last question she's asking is 2 or 3 invites, or does it just depend? Well,
we use 4. We typically will do 4, unless we just sell out, and we've done that where we've had over 2,500 people register for a webinar, or actually 5,000. We have to put in another webinar. Yeah, I would do up to 4. Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So let's go to the attendee ratio. Okay, now we're at the webinar. What does this measure? Well, this is another important metric because it tells you how many people, or a percent of the people, actually attended versus those that registered. And what it indicates is how interested were they in your topic. And was the value to the demographic right? Was this something they wanted to take time out of their day to attend? And it also impacts your post-webinar follow-up. Why? The more people you have attend, the more people that are going to be interested to hear what you have to say afterwards. They'll be more receptive to speak with you. But here's something that I think is very interesting on the analysis of a very high-performing, high-impact webinar. As you see on here, we had 3 touch points. We had 1,634 people register. We had a click-through ratio of 49%. But look at the attendee ratio in the bottom right-hand corner, 47%. There's a very definite correlation between how many people click through to register and actually attend. Now look at this. This is a little bit low, not quite as high performing. I say low performing or low impact. The click-through ratio was 24%, but the attendee ratio was only 39%. Not bad, but certainly not as great as the others. So how do you know if you're on track? Well, if you can get more than 50% of your registrants to attend, that's excellent. That's fantastic. 40% is about the target. 30 to 40% is pretty much the target. If you're under 30%, you're underperforming. Again, go back to the registration. Did you hit the right audience? Was it a compelling message? They just weren't interested enough. Now, you can calculate this actually 2 times. One, during the webinar, by just finding how many people registered and how many people are online and doing some simple division, or you can get it afterwards in the performance report. One of my favorite metrics is the third metric, which is during the webinar, which is the online polls. Again, we never get a chance to meet. The only opportunity we have to meet is right now online. This is my opportunity and our opportunity to find out what your interests are. And it gives us real-time feedback. And it indicates some important things. One is the level of engagement. If we're not getting a specific level of engagement, then I'll tell you what those numbers are. Probably the audience isn't paying attention. They're probably checking their mail. More importantly, it gives us your perspective. Joe and I were very interested to hear what kind of metrics you're using and what kind of platforms you're using. That was fantastic. But another thing it gives you is message shaping for your speakers. Because if you find out from your audience in their polls that their interests are a little bit different than what you thought, a good speaker will take that to their advantage, and she'll be able to use that and shape her messages to come out better. But you always want to look at the percentage of people that are responding to the poll as well as how they vote. So here's an example of what I consider a high-performance, high-impact poll. Now, look at the response rate, 66%. That was pretty high. We asked the question, how will you monitor your online reputation going forward? Look at the first one. I'm not sure. I would like help. 21% of the people said, they raised their hand. They said, I need help. Fabulous. Great opportunity after the webinar to follow up. They've said they want to hear from you. You've got their permission. 9% said they monitor only the sites, and so on and so forth. It gives you an idea of where people are at in the process. Now, how do you know if you're on track? I said there's 2 important benchmarks. One is the response, and this one here, if you can get 60 to 70% of your audience to respond to an online poll, you're doing really, really well. If you're over 75%, that's excellent. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, on the 2 polls we did, we were in the 70-75% area, so thank you. If you're under 50%, you're underperforming. Now, if you're a GoToWebinar user, you can find this information in the performance report, or what's really cool is in the attendee report, and I'm going to show you this in a bit. You can get a detailed calculation or results for each person who voted, so you really can understand how your prospects view what you're presenting to them. Okay. Now, we had a great webinar. We've gone through this. We've done a couple of different polls. Now it's time to get some feedback. And this was, I have to tell you, this was a real challenging one for us to do because it meant really exposing ourselves. What if people didn't like our webinar? But we said, let's go forward and figure it out. And this is something you want to do after the webinar. And what's really cool about the way GoToWebinar does it is you have an option of either doing it after the webinar, where a message will pop up in your browser, or you can send them a link. I like doing this after the webinar because it's fresh in people's mind and people want to be able to weigh in. But what does it measure? How well did you meet your audience's expectations? We always ask on a scale of 1 to 5, how did today's webinar meet your expectation, 5 being the highest? And that's valuable feedback, and I'll show you that in just a second. But here's what it indicates. Your brand and thought leadership is on display during the webinar. If you connected with your audience and they got a lot of value out of it, you know that they have respect for your brand and your thought leadership. You have credibility. It also gives you great ideas for future topics. Ask in the survey, what other webinar topics would you be interested in? We've gotten tons of great ideas for other topics. Plus, it's a great learning experience. You learn lessons for the next webinar, what you can do better. But again, always look at the percentage of people responding to the survey as well as how they vote. So let's
Hey, Mike, can I put a little bit of color with that?
Absolutely.
What you just said?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we ran. I talked to a webinar organizer a couple weeks ago, and he said that they have recurring new speakers that come in, and anyone that doesn't rate higher than a 4 is never asked back. And actually, they use that, and they tell the speakers that ahead of time because they want them to know that they'll never get another opportunity to do this unless they hit their audience expectations of 4 to 5.
That's excellent. That's great. No, I think that's fantastic. You know, the audiences want you to do well. All they ask is that you hold your end of the bargain up and give them something of value. And here's a perfect example. Okay, there's 2 metrics here. There's the response rate, 42%, which is very, very good. We've got a 91% positive rating. Now, let's be honest. You can't please everybody all the time. If you can get to 80% of positive ratings, you're doing very well. There's always going to be some people on the webinar that it didn't meet their expectations. It's not what they thought it would be, or they got up on the wrong side of the bed. There's just nothing you can do about it. So 91% positive rating is great. 42% response rate says that there were enough people after the webinar who cared enough about the content to tell you about it. Now, let's look at one that didn't perform quite as well. Notice this, the response rate was only 28%, only 73% positive rating. So we went from the higher performing webinar where we had a 42% response rate with a 91% positive rating to a 28% with 73% positive rating. So there's a lot of unhappy people on this particular webinar. But let's talk about how you know if you're on track. 2 benchmarks. One, response. If you get between 35 and 45% of your audience to give you feedback, that's excellent. If you're between 25 and 35%, that's where you should be. If you're under 25%, you missed the mark. Something happened. But here's what's really interesting. If you score on the scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest, if you're between a 3 and a 5, and you're over 90%, that's excellent. You hit the mark. If you're between 80 to 90% with 3 to 5, you're on target. Again, if you're under 80%, you've underperformed. Now, GoToWebinar users can find this information both in the performance report and for a detailed analysis by each attendee in the attendee report. And I'm going to show you how you use this. Now, let's go to, again, after the webinar on audience retention. So far we've looked at how we evaluate our ability to attract the audience, how well we've engaged them, what kind of feedback. Now, how well did we keep them interested enough to stay on the webinar? So this measures audience engagement, but it really impacts and indicates, number 1, did you deliver what you promised? If you said you were going to cover the following 3 things, but you didn't cover them, they probably said, wait a minute, that's not what I signed up for. If you had audio or technical challenges, now audiences are forgiving for this, but if you have poor audio and people can't hear you and your speakers are not connecting and they're not using the proper devices, believe me, this can impact the engagement. Again, it's your reputation, it's your brand and your thought leadership. Plus, it impacts your ability for post-webinar follow-up opportunities. The more they were online, the more they heard it, the more they had an interest in speaking with you afterwards. So let's take a look at this. Let's do a little analysis. These are the actual attendee counts through the webinar. And GoToWebinar provides this in the performance report, not as a graph, but as data points. And it automatically collects this information every 15 minutes or so. Now, this happened to have been for a 90-minute webinar. A very, very technical audience. But here's what was interesting. We would like to see 80% of the peak audience online at the start of the Q&A. And the Q&A is that bar over there where there was 329. We had 87% online at that time. And if you look at that, and if you take a look at that, pretty steady retention, pretty steady interest throughout the webinar. So that's great. That tells you they were interested, they were hanging in there, there were questions, and even when we adjourned, we had quite a few people on there. So how do you know if you're on track? Again, at the start of the Q&A, shoot for 85%. That's excellent. If you're 75 to 85%, you're on target. If you're under 75%, you're probably underperforming. You can find this information if you're a GoToWebinar user in the performance report. And as I said, there's a time snapshot of the dates, and I just charted it. Now, here's what I find to be the real fun part, and here's some opportunity to do some content marketing. John, I'm sure you don't mind if I talk about that.
No, absolutely. But you know what? We're getting a lot. If you let's just stop for a second, because we're getting a lot of questions on devices, microphone devices.
Yes.
I just think we should stop and say, I know you and I covered this on the last one, but it's so critical. I mean, you and I are both on pretty professional headsets. Can you just take 2 seconds and talk about that importance? Because I know in our audience it's so critical to make sure that if your speakers don't sound like they're coming in clearly, it's going to really affect your drop-off rates like you talked about.
Absolutely. I'll give you a real quick flyby. There's two things to consider in an audio device. One is the diaphragm, and that's the device that you speak into that moves the air. The other is the electronics. If you start with the most basic device, which is a landline, you have a very small diaphragm, very small electronics. You get an okay sound, but it's clearly not broadcast quality. If you go to a consumer audio headset that folks use for gaming, you have a little bit better electronics, a little bit larger diaphragm. But if you really want to connect, like you and I are using, we use a professional microphone, and you know what? They're not that expensive. They're about $125, and they're a USB microphone. I use a pair of headsets, and they really make for a crisp connection. Things you don't want to do is a speakerphone, because that creates a barrier between you and your audience, and it can create echoes and feedback. Those are the three key things to use, and actually we have an audio brief that we've also been commissioned by GoToWebinar to do exactly on this topic. So that's going to be coming out on things you need to know for audio best practices. But Joe, did I answer the question
You did. That
okay.
was fantastic, and I didn't want to interrupt your because you were getting into content marketing, so I'm ready to do it. So go right ahead.
You have an interest in that, I take it.
A little bit. Yeah.
Okay, but just to go back to the audio, absolutely critical. I mean, we did a webinar once, and it said what your audience doesn't know about internet audio can be deafening, and audio can be the Achilles heel. So if you guys have any questions on it, just let me know. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. So now let's get into the after the webinar and the on-demand viewings, and really this is, I call this the gift that keeps giving. And the question that we had earlier in the webinar on results, this will blow you away. The best thing that an on-demand viewing represents, and this is something that GoToWebinar is going to do after this particular webinar today, where they're going to archive it, and then they're going to allow people who either registered but didn't get to attend or want to review it again. And that's what's so great about it. And it's archived for up to a year. And when I say it's the gift that keeps giving, because it really helps you not only get to the people in the audience that want to see it again, but you get fresh new sales leads. And this is where it's really exciting. Plus, it's must-have content. I happen to believe that webinars are the most effective form and the most exciting form of content marketing, because they breathe life into a subject. And here's your opportunity to take this as an on-demand recording and share it for a long time. So take a look at this. This was a on-demand viewing that we did. We had 686 people register for the webinar. We had 358, I think, people attend. But look at this. In the first 45 days, we had 431 people view it. And when we break it down, we found that we had 90 viewings from 12% of the people that registered but didn't attend. The people that attended and wanted to repeat a viewing were 59, or 8%. But look at this, Joe. 617 fresh new sales leads. 80% of the 777 viewings were from the webinar. That's because it went viral. That's because the client promoted it on their website, they blogged about it, and people picked up on it and they wanted to hear it. So hopefully, Joe, that was this kind of puts a great point on that question on what kind of results you can get afterwards. And
well, I think the point is, and you and I have seen this, where of those that register, you're going to see about 80% of those view it at some point. A lot of people just can't get to it. A lot of people on this call, they showed up and they left because they got to go do something, but they want to come back to the content if it's really good content.
Right, and the thing is too, I may mention this now, but remember, if somebody opted in for your webinar, they're interested whether they attended or not. But let's take a look to get specifically to the question that we had earlier. How do you know if you're on track? If you can get more than 50% of your on-demand viewings, that's excellent. 15 to 30% is reasonable. That's a good target. If you're under 15%, you're underperforming. And this is the fourth report that you can get from GoToWebinar. It's in the Generate Reports under Recorded Webinar. And what's interesting is you can take, if you take your registration report and your attendee report and your on-demand report, you can do a little table there and find out how many are fresh new sales leads. That's how we're able to do that. Okay, so we've just gone through 6 key webinar metrics. Now let's get into how do we take these to convert prospects into customers. But first, let's go back and do a little analysis on our webinar. Did we have predictable outcomes? Did we meet our webinar objectives? Did we give value to the audience? Were our success factors met? Was our call to action clear? Are we ready to go? And most importantly, let's move into reviewing the life cycle intelligence. We've gathered a lot of information over the period of this webinar. Probably a good 3 weeks worth of information we've had to profile information and pull this all together. But let's take a look now at what we want to do. Now we want to put our sales and marketing hat on. And here's the opportunity to maximize the follow-up after the webinar. And as I like to say, start a warm conversation. Because isn't it always easier, Joe, to have a conversation where you come across being interested in knowing something about the other person than just sounding cold and transactional? I think that's
definitely the way you'd want to go over the other way.
Right. I sound like I know a little bit about you. So there's 3 things you need to do. Here's your call to action. Archive a copy of the recorded webinar. If you have an interest in editing it out, you can do that. Now, within 24 to 48 hours, you want to send a follow-up and a thank you emails, and you want to begin to include valuable content and information, such as the slides for today, a link to today's recording. But the third step is the most important one, is doing the final registration, attendance, and performance analytics. I always like to create a dashboard at a glance. This kind of gives me an idea of what my click-through ratio was on registration, and what my attendance and performance metrics were, just something to look at. I also want to analyze other life cycle intelligence. What industries were represented? That's very helpful to know. And sometimes we'll ask, what kind of inertial technology are you most interested in? This was very, very interesting to the audience, but also to the sponsor to know where their interests were. So we collect this information with others. But here is where the rubber hits the road, Joe. You can gather insights by attending. Now, I'm only taking a snapshot of a few columns. Obviously, what's not on here is the person's name, their title, their industry. But look what we can learn about them. We can learn some of their interest. We can learn, in this case, do they plan to purchase this year? They're not sure. The other one says yes. What would they like to learn? How do they rate today? What could we have done better? What did you like the most? And what other webinar topics would you be interested in? And you can see how they voted in each of the polls. Plus, we captured their questions. They have an interest when discussing multi-sensor fusion. Are there, whatever it is. When you call that person back, you can have a conversation and you know something about them and say, Joe, I know you had a question about multi-sensor fusion. May we take a few moments to discuss it? Of course. So this is where you get tremendous information, and you pass this on to your sales teams and your lead follow-up teams. It's wonderful follow-up.
Well, I think to your point too, if you're asking the right questions like you were showing there, you can score those leads right out the gate to integrate with your marketing automation system.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the next point here, Joe, is that you start segmenting, get your sales ready leads. And one of the things that's interesting on when you get people doing registration, you will actually get people to leave you a comment. I'm interested in a demo. I'm interested in making a purchase. We're looking at competitive systems. Do you think you'd call those people right away? I mean, people will give you that information, and it's fabulous. So you can tell who's sales ready. The ones that aren't qualifying, don't go after them. The ones that need nurturing, then use whatever type of nurturing process you have. But let's kind of summarize. We've gone over 6 key metrics. They're not all the metrics, but they're the metrics that will absolutely help you ensure predictable outcomes. Absolutely important to do that. You define your objectives and your success factors. And you want to use lifecycle intelligence as much as possible. Every day, don't wait till the end. Use that every day to fine-tune and to tweak your message. And always follow up 24 to 48 hours post-webinar while people are still interested. I'd also tell you to get started is to do what we did, build an ongoing webinar database. You can create it in a pivot table or whatever else you want, and then you can start to create your own benchmarks and lessons learned. So that's the basic formal part of this, Joe, and I know we want to get to some questions. Do you have anything else you wanted to say before I go to the next portion?
No, I think that, we have a ton of questions that I'm looking at, so whenever you're ready, we can start with the Q&A.
Okay, let's start with the Q&A, but I also wanted to give people an opportunity who would be interested to continue the conversation or get a free copy of the ebook that just came out today. I'm going to go ahead and launch this. And go ahead and vote, and then we can go right into the Q&A as people are putting in their feedback there. So Joe, I'm ready.
All right, sounds good. I think that where we want to start, I think, would probably be on the marketing side because we got a ton on marketing.
Okay.
Let's talk about the different kinds of marketing efforts outside of email. What has worked for you? Email seems to be the core of everything you're talking about. Is there something more than email we should be doing?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that 85 to 90% of the registrations come from email marketing, but there's also social media. There's also blogging. One of the things that we recommend is to be participating in some thought leadership groups on LinkedIn. Join the conversation. That's always a great way to get people in. There's actually even an interesting service called webinarlistings.com, which will let you post your webinar for free, so it's kind of a clearinghouse. I think those are some of the best ways. Another way is affiliating with an online media publisher who's got a great list that you can work off of. But by and large, Joe, most of our registrations come from email marketing.
Yeah, I think that we've seen the same thing at Content Marketing Institute webinars, where the initial push is almost always from email, but then the on-demand viewership can come from a lot of different ways. And actually, Susan asked a really good question I want to get your take on. When it comes to archiving the Q&A or doing, let's say, having a reporter cover your webinar so that you can create blog content, have you seen some good usages of that where you're actually creating content from the webinar itself in a blog format?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the example that I gave earlier where we had 681 or whatever it was leads, that's exactly what they do. They take the on-demand viewing and they edit it and they blog it, they post it on their website, they write articles around it, and that's helped drive a lot of interest back into viewing the on-demand. Very
good. Here's another one that's been asked a couple times. For all the metrics that you've seen and worked on and presented today, Mike, have any of those helped you predict which day and time of the week works best?
That's a great question. The answer is it doesn't really matter if what you have is what they want. And what I mean by that is in a B2B world, we find that the 3 best days of the week are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and either starting at 10 a.m. on the West Coast, 1 p.m. on the East Coast, or 11 a.m. on the West Coast, 2 p.m. on the East Coast. What we have found is that it doesn't matter. If it's a topic that really addresses a pressing issue and there's a lot of interest in it, they'll come. So yeah, the answer is it doesn't really matter. If, again, content drives the registration.
Actually, it's interesting. PJ asked an interesting question. I have a take on it, but I'd like to get yours. So what PJ asked is he has speakers he or she has speakers all over the world that kind of donate their time to speaking for the webinar, and some of them don't have the equipment like we have or the opportunities to get that. What would you recommend, or are they just kind of they have to use whatever they have?
You mean if they're speaking from all over the world?
Yeah, if they're speaking and they're just donating their time, is there something that they can do or you should recommend them doing?
You mean from a communication standpoint on how they?
Yeah, I guess. Well, I mean, I'll give you my idea, and then I don't know if you have
Sure,
any. But
sure.
when I was doing a webinar for another company, what they would say is they would actually send us equipment, because they said, well, what equipment do you have? I said, well, I was just going to call on the phone, and they said, here, use this equipment, and they actually sent it to us, almost like leasing it to us for the webinar that we had to then send back to use the right equipment. So I don't know if you've seen that done before, or if that's even an option.
Actually, yes. For some of our clients where we do multiple webinars, we've actually bought headsets for them, USB headsets, and send them off to them, because good speakers, you never know where they're going to be. They're in demand. They're traveling. What I would tell you is what you don't want to do is please don't have them use a cell phone. That's almost certainly going to cause a failure. Don't have them use a wireless device. I cannot tell you, honestly, we've had people in France and in the UK, they've used a wireless device and the battery goes dead. So I think if you can't use something better than a consumer headset or a professional microphone or a landline, use those. Don't use something that's going to be wireless. You always want to use a wired device.
Absolutely. Ron wants to know, Ron actually does a series of webinars, and they're 2 hours in length with a 5-minute break in between. And Ron thinks they're probably too long, but I wanted to get your take on the length of webinar.
We usually find that for a demand generation webinar, an informational webinar, 60 minutes is ideal. From let's go, from when you welcome the audience to when you adjourn. Just as we're doing today, we wanted to come into the Q&A and give about 40 minutes. Now, I'm 40 minutes for the content and about 20 minutes for the Q&A. An hour is an ideal time. People are used to blocking out an hour on their calendar. That's not a difficulty. I mentioned, though, for that other webinar we did, we've done a couple 90-minute webinars, highly technical, audience was highly engaged. I think it all depends on the topic and the content, but certainly between 60 minutes and 90 minutes is the ideal time. And I think it's safe to say that one of the challenges of doing a webinar is, number one, it's a radio show with pictures, but number two, how do you succinctly get your message across in the shortest amount of time by giving people value? So more isn't necessarily better, Joe.
No, I would agree with that. You say what you have to say in the time, and don't have to use all the time allotted. Say it in the minimum amount of time, if it makes sense. Just want to let everybody know we've got about another 10 minutes for questions and answers, so please, if you have any questions, go ahead and fill those in, and I'll see if I can get to them. This is my question, because I'm just curious, because I mean, you do webinars full time. What is the one trend you've seen that really makes all the difference in high performing webinars, either from a sponsor standpoint or from the audience standpoint?
I think that there are two drivers there, Joe. One, remembering where somebody's interests are. If they're in a situation where they're not happy or dissatisfied with their current state, whatever that may be, or they know there's a better solution out there, they're going to be interested. Two, if they're already looking for another solution or provider, they're going to be interested. Usually people who are indifferent aren't going to be interested, but the more succinct you can be on those two. And I'll give you an example. We have a client that has an industry in transition and disruption. They're a major provider of print advertising, but the whole marketplace is going to digital. Not only is their business model disrupted, but those of their customers have been disrupted. And so we have put together a thought leadership series of webinars teaching a tutorial teaching their customers how to use social media, how to use QR codes, why they should get on the bandwagon with mobile. They can't get enough of it. Timely, important information that's critical to running someone's business is what's going to get somebody. That's the biggest trend that I've seen. I mean, I think, even 6 months ago, a year ago, you could take a dog with a note in his mouth and say, attend my free webinar, and people would sign up. Can't do that anymore. You really got to have something to deliver.
Boy, that was back in the good old days.
Yeah, 6 months ago.
I started doing webinars, I started doing webinars in 2000, and they have changed quite a bit since then. There's a lot of competition out there. There's a couple questions on video. Do you have
Sure.
a take? Use it? Don't use it? If you do, how long? Anything?
Yeah, I think video is a fascinating forum, and my take on video is, if you mean having the presenters being live on video.
Well, I think we've had a couple different questions around video.
Sure.
So I'll put it in this context. One is, do you just use video or show video during your presentation as a sample? Like if we were to show a video during the middle of your presentation would be one. The second one, do you look at video, talking head versus slides? So I think there's a couple different ways to go.
All right, let me answer the first one. If the answer is this, if the content of the video is going to add value to the discussion and reinforce a key point, either as part of a case study or a tutorial, then yeah, we do that. No problem at all. However, if it's not going to add value and it could perhaps be conceived as promotional or commercial, then I wouldn't do it. I had one client who wanted to show a 2.5 video of their company, and I said, listen, why not, let's just not do the webinar. I mean, nobody wants to sit through a 2.5 video of your company. They want to hear. They're tuning in to hear. They don't want to go through that. Now, it can add a lot of value. But on the other part, I would, going back to what I said before, there's enough challenges to pull off a webinar and have it be polished with the audio considerations that when you start adding in video, you've got to be concerned about people's lighting. How do they look on camera? The camera never lies. If they're not smiling, if they're bored, distracted, if they have a frown, it's going to come across, and it's not going to impact and connect with the audience the way you want it to. So I think there's going to be some great future for video. I can't wait till it's ready to use, but those are my considerations, Joe.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the great thing, because there's a lot of questions here on video, like why do most webinars not have live video and whatnot. There's not a technology issue or a bandwidth issue as much, although there is some, right? But not as much as there used to be. But I think your point is I think we just need to think about, is there additional value provided by having the video?
Right.
Because if there's not, then don't just do video for video's sake. I think that's what you're trying to say, correct?
Yeah, I mean, radio still works, and it's probably one of the most engaging forms of entertainment if you're able to get a conversation and be drawn into it. So, and particularly for demand gen webinar, if you're doing an hour or less, I don't think having to have a talking head is that critical.
Agreed. Couple questions on recorded webinar versus live webinar. What do you think?
Well, I always like to have a recording afterwards, but I got to tell you, there's something about doing this live, like we're doing it right now, that gets you to focus and just be on your game. When you record a webinar before you do it, you ultimately end up, I didn't like that. Let's do another take. Let's do another take. Let's do this. And you end up spending more time on it, and you might think you have something that's perfect, but I think it loses some of the spontaneity. I know some people like to do that, but I like it to be live, right now, here and now, connecting to the audience.
Yeah, I would agree. And with the quality of questions that we're getting in, I mean, I think that makes all the difference in the world.
Of course, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. What's a question that, and because I want to get your take on this too, what's a question that you normally get that we haven't asked yet that is maybe your most popular question or the thing that has the most value from your perspective?
Well,
so, I don't want to set you up for here, but I mean, you do this stuff, every day of every week.
Well, I would say probably what people have in mind for doing a case study. We've done some case studies that have been fabulous, that have really talked about the use case. They've talked about the challenges. They've talked about the options to solve it. They've talked about the results, what was implemented, the business value, versus some people think that what they're going to do is just a covert sales pitch. And that becomes a real challenge, Joe, in working with them, because they think that whatever they have, and they should, is the greatest thing around. But if it's a sales pitch, it's not going to work. So I would say we got a lot of questions on that. And also I would say the other part of it is, overall, when we start working with a client, so many of them come to the table. We're ready to go with what? Well, we got our slides. Well, what's your message? Well, I don't know. Well, what do you want to tell them? Not sure. What do you want them to do afterwards? So a lot of people come to this not understanding the whole life cycle of what it takes to put everything together to connect with an audience. I think those are probably the two biggest things that I see overall.
No, very good insight. So I think we're just about out of time, and I'm going to leave with this question, because, and this is one that concerns me all the time, just because as we're doing webinars, and we do a webinar once or twice a month, I get concerned about hitting that list too much with email invitations. So do you have a proof point that says that 4 is the best over, because I keep pushing back on our audience development person saying I only want to do 2 versus 4. When you get to your core number that you're trying to hit, can you stop? I mean, so just give some clarity to the amount of times you can hit that list, because we know that email works the best, but also, I mean, that's your list. That's your trust in the relationship as well.
It's a great question. I'm going to answer it 2 ways. From a best practices standpoint, we do not hit the same list more than once every 90 days. Okay? That's the surest way to fatigue a list and to get people annoyed. However, if you have something of value and that's of interest to them and they want to attend, there's nothing wrong with going out with another value proposition. As long as what you're going out with is new and different and you know what they're going to be interested in it, I have no problem doing that. But as a rule of thumb, I would say definitely you don't want to go out more than once every 90 days.
Well, I think that's words to live by if we can do it. And I know a lot of companies, maybe the key is that we've all got to do a better job on our audience development and how we market and campaign for the webinar standpoint. So,
yep.
All right, my friend. I think we got to wrap it up here because we're running up against the hour. First of all, Mike, thank you so much. Fantastic job as always. I want to thank every one of you that are on the webinar presentation today for joining us today. There have been a lot of questions. I think we've gotten to most of them, but you will be receiving an email that will alert you to the on-demand status of today's event so that you can review any material you missed, and you may just want to go over it again because there was a lot of really good information, especially on those statistics that Mike was going over. Make sure you please fill out our survey when you exit the webinar. And really, I mean, this is important to both Mike and myself. We need to get this information so we can do a better job for you the next time. Let us know. And hopefully, Mike, we'll get into that high-impact webinar standpoint with the information we'll get from the survey. Well, on behalf of my guest, Mike Agron, as well as the folks at Citrix's GoToWebinar, thank you so much, and Content Marketing Institute, my name is Joe Polizzi. We wish you a good day. Thank you again for joining us and taking the time to view the presentation.
Muted. The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.